When you take a language model and connect it to tools, you create something that can do more than talk. It can fetch data, send requests, trigger workflows, or take actions in other systems. And that step changes everything from a security perspective. The model is no longer just producing text. It is participating in operations, which means mistakes can turn into real-world impact. Systems that combine a model with tools are often called agents. And for security AI plus, the key idea is that agent safety is not primarily about making the model polite. Agent safety is about controlling what actions are possible, under what permissions, within what scope, and with what boundaries that prevent harmful or unauthorized behavior. Beginners sometimes assume the model will naturally act responsibly, but defenders assume the opposite. Any interface that can act will eventually be probed, misused, or triggered by accident. The goal is to build safe action boundaries so the system's power is bounded by design, not by hope. By the end of this episode, you should be able to explain why tool access is an attack surface and how permissions, scope, and boundaries reduce risk. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To make this concrete, start by separating two kinds of risk: the model giving bad advice and the model taking a bad action. Bad advice can mislead a human, but a human can often catch it, question it, or ignore it. Bad action can happen quickly and silently, and it can damage systems before anyone notices. That's why adding tools increases the need for governance. The model might be instructed to query a database, open a ticket, change a configuration, or send a message, and each of those actions can have confidentiality, integrity, and availability impact. A defender immediately asks, what is the worst thing this agent could do if it is confused or manipulated? That question is not pessimism. It is standard threat modeling. Once you know the worst case, you can design boundaries that make the worst case impossible or at least very difficult. This is the same mindset as limiting what a service account can do, because you assume compromise and you reduce blast radius. Permissions are the first and most important control because they define what the agent is allowed to do in other systems. In classic security, permissions are granted to identities, and identities should follow least privilege, meaning they should have only the minimum access needed to do the job. An agent should be treated like an identity with privileges, even if it feels like a chat assistant. If you give the agent broad permissions, you create a powerful attacker if the system can be manipulated. If you give the agent narrow permissions, you reduce the blast radius of mistakes and malicious prompts. Beginners often think permissions will slow the system down or make it less useful, but a defender sees permissions as what makes the system usable safely. Useful and dangerous are not opposites. They are often partners, and permissions let you keep usefulness while limiting danger. On an exam, when you see an agent with broad access and a risk of misuse, least privilege is almost always part of the correct defensive framing. Permissions also need to be separated by function, because not all tool actions are equal. Reading data is different from writing data, and writing data is different from executing changes, and executing changes is different from irreversible destructive actions. A safe design often uses separate permission tiers, so the agent can gather information widely, but can only make changes narrowly, and high-impact actions require additional checks. For example, an agent might be allowed to read logs, but not to modify them, because modifying logs can destroy evidence. It might be allowed to draft a ticket, but not to close it, because closure is an authoritative decision. This pattern is the same as giving a junior analyst read access and requiring a senior analyst to approve major changes. The agent is not a senior analyst. It is an automation component. When you treat the agent like a component that should be constrained, you avoid the common mistake of granting it God mode because it feels convenient during development. Convenience is not a justification for privilege and security, and agent systems are a perfect place for that lesson. Scope is the second control, and it defines the boundaries of what the agent can touch even within its permissions. Scope is about narrowing the domain, the data, the time frame, and the systems that are in play for a given task. For example, an agent might have permission to query a database, but scope determines which tables, which tenants, which accounts, or which time ranges it can query. In security, scope prevents broad searches that can become reconnaissance or data harvesting. It also reduces accidental exposure, because the agent cannot pull sensitive information from areas unrelated to the user's request. Beginners often confuse scope with permission, but they are different layers. Permission is the ability to use a tool. Scope is the boundary inside that tool. A defender uses both because each catches different failures. If the agent is allowed to call a search function, scoping ensures it searches only within what the user is authorized to access and only for what is needed, rather than turning into a universal internal search engine. Scope also applies to actions, not just data. If an agent can create tickets, scope might define which project queues it can use and which fields it can populate. If an agent can run an automated response, scope might define which systems it can isolate and which it cannot touch, perhaps excluding critical production systems unless a human approves. Scope can also include rate limits, meaning how often actions can be taken, because repeated actions at speed can create a denial of service effect even if each individual action is allowed. This is a classic automation risk. The agent can amplify mistakes. By limiting scope and rate, you reduce the chance of runaway behavior, whether caused by a bug, a prompt injection, or a misunderstood request. In exam scenarios that describe an agent taking too many actions too quickly, the correct defensive response often includes narrowing scope and adding throttles, not merely improving prompts. Prompts are helpful, but scope is enforceable, and enforceable controls are what defenders rely on. Safe action boundaries are the third control, and they are about preventing the agent from crossing into dangerous territory, even when permissions and scope might allow it. Boundaries can be implemented as hard rules, such as never perform destructive actions automatically or always require confirmation before changing security settings. They can also be implemented as workflows, such as draft and recommend rather than execute, or propose and wait for approval. The key idea is that the agent should default to safe actions, meaning actions that are reversible, observable, and low impact, especially when uncertainty is high. In security operations, first actions are often about gathering evidence and containing risk without making irreversible changes. An agent should follow that posture too. Beginners sometimes want the agent to be fully autonomous because autonomy feels like the point, but autonomy without boundaries is how you create an automated incident. A defender designs autonomy in layers, where low-risk actions can be automated and high-risk actions require human involvement. A safe boundary also includes what the agent is allowed to decide versus what it is allowed to suggest. Decision authority is a security concept because deciding to block a user or to isolate a system is an authorization decision with consequences. If the agent is allowed to decide, then the agent effectively becomes a policy actor, and that requires extremely strong assurance. In most real deployments, a safer approach is decision support, where the agent prepares evidence, summarizes context, and suggests actions, but a human confirms the final decision for high-impact steps. This reduces the chance that the agent's confident language turns into unreviewed action. It also creates accountability, which matters for governance and learning from mistakes. In exam terms, if you are asked how to reduce the risk of harmful automated actions, human-in-the-loop boundaries are often part of the best answer, especially for destructive or irreversible actions. This is not anti-automation. It is responsible automation that matches impact to control. Another important boundary is verification, meaning the system should verify preconditions before acting. In security, acting on stale or incomplete information is a common cause of harm. An agent might isolate the wrong host if it misidentifies the asset, or it might revoke the wrong access if it confuses identities, or it might apply a mitigation that is inappropriate for the environment. A safe design includes checks like confirming identity, confirming target scope, and confirming that the action is allowed under policy. It can also include checks that the action is reversible and that monitoring is in place to detect negative side effects. Verification can be automated for some aspects and manual for others, but the principle is the same. Never assume the model's interpretation is correct when the stakes are high. This is also where logging matters, because verification and action should leave an audit trail. A defender prefers systems that are observable, because observability is how you detect misuse and contain damage. Tool use also creates a prompt injection pathway that is more dangerous than purely text-based injection, because the attacker's goal can be to cause real actions. If an attacker can craft input that persuades the agent to call a tool, the attacker can potentially exfiltrate data, modify records, or trigger workflows. This is why the system must treat user input and retrieve content as untrusted and must prevent untrusted text from directly controlling tool calls. Safe designs separate planning from execution, meaning the model can propose a tool action, but a policy layer verifies whether the action is allowed for that user and that context before the tool is actually invoked. This policy layer is sometimes described as a guardrail or a controller, but the key concept is that the model should not be the only gatekeeper for tool use. In security, you never rely on one gate when you can layer gates, especially when the gate is probabilistic. Exam scenarios that involve an agent being tricked into taking actions often point toward adding policy enforcement outside the model and tightening tool call permissions and scope. Data exposure risk increases when tools can retrieve sensitive information, because the agent might pull information into its context and then disclose it in its response. Even if the tool access is legitimate, the disclosure might not be, especially if the user lacks permission or if the content is sensitive in a way that requires careful handling. This is where output constraints and redaction rules matter, but they cannot substitute for access control. The safer approach is to ensure the tool returns only what the user is allowed to see and only what is needed for the task, which is a form of scoped retrieval. You also design the agent to minimize what it brings into context, because context is where leakage becomes possible. Another subtle risk is that tool outputs can contain attacker-controlled strings, such as log messages or user-generated content, which can be used for prompt injection if treated as instructions. A defender therefore sanitizes and labels tool outputs as untrusted evidence, keeping them separate from the instruction layer and preventing them from steering tool calls. This is retrieval safety applied to tool use. Operational safety also depends on monitoring and limits, because an agent with tools can become a high-speed actor in your environment. You want to know what tools are being called, by whom, for what purpose, and with what parameters, and you want alerts when behavior deviates from normal patterns. This is the same philosophy as monitoring privileged accounts, because the agent is effectively a privileged account. Rate limiting prevents runaway loops, and circuit breakers can stop actions when anomalies are detected, such as too many changes in a short time or too many failed attempts. These controls also help against abuse, because attackers often probe repeatedly, and repeated probing should trigger containment. Another operational practice is to separate environments, so the agent can test actions in a safe sandbox before touching production systems. Even when the agent cannot directly run commands, it can still trigger workflows that have impact, so environment separation remains relevant. Exam questions that involve an agent causing disruption often have correct answers that involve monitoring, throttling, and controlled deployment boundaries rather than only prompt improvements. A common beginner misconception is that if you instruct the agent to be careful, it will always be careful, and that is a dangerous assumption when real actions are possible. Another misconception is that tool access should be as broad as possible to maximize usefulness, when broad access creates broad blast radius and broad leak potential. A third misconception is that the main risk is malicious users, when accidental misuse by well-meaning users can also cause harm, especially when they paste sensitive information or ask for actions without understanding consequences. Defenders respond by designing for both malice and mistake, because both exist. They also treat agents as part of the security architecture, meaning agents should undergo threat modeling, access review, and change control the same way any other privileged system would. If you recognize that an agent is a privileged interface, you naturally apply least privilege, scope limitation, verification, and monitoring. That recognition is the difference between a clever demo and a secure system. The simplest way to keep all of this straight is to think of 3 concentric rings of protection around tool use. Permissions define what tools can do at all, and they should follow least privilege to limit blast radius. Scope defines what the tools can touch in a given context, narrowing data and action boundaries so the agent cannot roam. Safe action boundaries define how and when actions are allowed, emphasizing reversibility, verification, and human approval for high-impact steps. Around all of that, you add monitoring, rate limits, and auditability so you can detect misuse, contain errors, and learn from incidents. This layered approach works because no single control is perfect, and the model itself is not a deterministic policy engine. The model can propose, but policy controls must dispose, meaning an external boundary must decide what is allowed. When you design agents this way, you keep the productivity benefits without creating an automated insider threat. What Security AI Plus wants you to be able to do is look at an agent design and immediately ask, what can it do? What should it be allowed to do? And what stops it when it is wrong? If an agent can access sensitive data, you demand strict permissions and scope retrieval so it cannot become an exfiltration path. If an agent can take actions, you demand safe action boundaries and human approval for high-impact changes so it cannot become an automated attacker. If an agent can act at speed, you demand monitoring and rate limits so it cannot amplify mistakes. These are defender instincts applied to a new kind of interface. When you hold on to that mindset, you stop being impressed by tool integration as a feature and start evaluating it as an attack surface with controls. That shift is exactly what makes you capable of answering scenario questions about agents safely, and it is exactly what makes modern AI systems governable in real security environments.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.